Why did the room go silent the moment she stepped inside, even though no one could explain why? 250 elite soldiers filled the hangar, boots scraping concrete, voices overlapping in practiced confidence. Men who had kicked doors in places that didn't exist on maps. Men used to owning every space they entered. And yet when she crossed the threshold, something shifted. Not respect, not fear, more like irritation, confusion, a subtle offense they couldn't name. She didn't look like a threat. That was the problem. Arden Vale moved with neither hurry nor hesitation, the way people do when they've already learned the cost of both. Plain jacket, no insignia, hair pulled back without care for symmetry. She carried a small backpack, light enough to look unimpressive, heavy enough to mean something. Her eyes didn't scan the room the way newcomers did. She already knew where the exits were, where the blind spots would be, who was watching her. And who was. She felt the weight of it immediately, the unspoken judgment, the unearned conclusions. Translator, civilian, temporary, replaceable. The label slid over her like dust. She let it settle. Some battles were won by not fighting them at least not yet. The first test came quietly. A crate swung too wide. An elbow lingered too long. A shoulder drifted into her path with plausible deniability written all over it. She adjusted without breaking stride, not defensive, just precise. Enough that a few soldiers frowned, uncertain why their instincts had misfired. She felt the familiar emotion rise. Not anger, something older, the dull ache of being underestimated again, the memory of rooms like this one. Different base, different decade, same smell of oil and arrogance. Back then, she'd still believed competence would speak for itself. She knew better now. The briefing began. Her name barely registered when it was mentioned. Civilian linguist, support role. The laughter wasn't cruel at first. It rarely is. It grew that way. A chair pulled back. A joke sharpened. Words thrown like pebbles to see which ones would draw blood. She didn't respond. Silence had always unsettled them more than defiance. But when the jokes turned technical, when they tried to expose her, to trip her with language meant to humiliate, she answered. Calmly, perfectly. In dialects most of them had only heard shouted in panic. She corrected grammar, context, meaning. She didn't raise her voice, didn't smirk, just spoke. And something broke. Because ignorance can be laughed off, but being shown inferior, that lingers. From that moment on, the mood changed. Mockery hardened into intent. They stopped trying to embarrass her. They started trying to break her. She noticed the shift. She always did. By midday, isolation became the weapon. Water withheld. Shade denied. Accidents engineered. She stood in the sun and let them watch her not wilt. Her breathing stayed slow. Her posture didn't sag. Men 10 years younger wiped sweat from their brows while she conserved herself like someone who had learned how long endurance actually lasts. Still, she said nothing. Not because she was afraid. Because she was waiting. The challenge came the way it always does, framed as a joke, hand to hand, friendly demonstration, a chance for everyone to laugh and move on. She saw the money change hands, heard the bets, saw how certain they were of her humiliation. She felt something else then, not fear, not doubt, sadness. Because once she stepped onto that mat, there would be no going back. She removed her shoes when the floor was slicked against her, bare feet on canvas, scarred, grounded, the laughter spiked. They mistook familiarity with the earth for weakness. The first man lunged, trained, confident, angry. He hit the ground faster than anyone expected. The silence afterward was fragile, like glass stretched thin. It shattered when desperation took over. A knife. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. She moved inside it, ended it, and stood still as his body collapsed. Panic followed. Accusations, shouts, a need to believe the impossible hadn't just happened. Then the commander stepped forward. Pride has weight. It makes men heavier, slower. He charged with history behind him, reputation, violence sharpened by years of being feared instead of questioned. She didn't rush him, she waited, let him commit. When he fell, the sound wasn't dramatic, just final. And when she spoke quietly, evenly, a Navy SEAL that week, it wasn't an insult. It was an observation. What followed wasn't victory, it was consequence. Rank failed, authority collapsed, a black card surfaced and with it a truth that rearranged the room. She wasn't unknown, she was erased, the architect of doctrines they worshipped, the ghost behind their manuals. A helicopter arrived, a general saluted her. And still she didn't smile. Because redemption isn't loud, it doesn't need witnesses, it doesn't demand apologies. She walked away the same way she had entered, unnoticed by the world, unforgettable to the men who had learned too late. Later, in a quiet apartment, she set down her bag, straightened an old photograph, made coffee. The day ended without ceremony. Strength had done its work. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did her hands stay so steady when every instinct in the room wanted her to flinch? The sun had climbed higher by the time the briefing dissolved into movement, its heat pressing down on the compound like a held breath. Men rose from folding chairs, stretching, laughing, slapping each other's shoulders as if nothing unusual had happened. As if the quiet woman at the back hadn't just exposed more than a few cracks in their confidence. Arden remained where she was for a moment longer, watching the flow of bodies like water finding familiar paths. She waited until the exits cleared, until the noise softened into background static, then stepped forward with the same measured pace. She felt it again, that subtle recalibration in the air, not respect, not yet, something closer to suspicion. Out on the training field, the world opened up into heat, shimmer, and dust. Targets lined the perimeter. Urban mock-ups rose in harsh concrete angles. Radios crackled with clipped voices. This was where they felt at home, where muscle memory replaced thought, where they believed no outsider could follow the rhythm. Arden stood near the observation post, clipboard tucked under her arm. The role fit well enough. The invisibility was almost comfortable. Almost. She watched them move, not with awe, with analysis. She noted timing delays, communication gaps, the way certain men overcompensated when watched. She saw who relied on noise instead of awareness, who mistook aggression for speed. Her pen moved sparingly. She had learned long ago that writing everything down only dulled the edge of what mattered. A familiar feeling crept in, the ache of knowing more than she was allowed to say, of seeing the outcome before the mistake was made, and understanding that warning too early only painted a target on your back. It had been drilled into her once in another life. Observe, endure, act only when action becomes unavoidable. She didn't miss the way Jonah Cross angled toward her during a water break, his approach casual in the way predators pretend not to hunt. He was smiling. That smile never reached his eyes. "So," he said, stopping just outside her personal space, "you actually following any of this or just pretending?" His friends hovered behind him, forming a loose half-circle. Their shadows swallowed her feet. She looked up slowly, meeting his gaze without challenge, without submission either. "I'm following," she said. That was all. It irritated him more than silence would have. He scoffed, rolling his shoulders. Must be nice, watching real work without the pressure. The word real hung there, heavy with implication. Arden felt a flicker of something, not anger, not fear, weariness. The kind that comes from hearing the same song in too many different rooms. She set the clipboard down carefully, as if the motion itself required respect. "I'm here for the assignment," she said. Jonah laughed, sharp and loud, designed to draw attention. "Assignment," he repeated like it was a joke. "You hear that? She's on assignment." Someone behind him chimed in. "What assignment? Writing notes about how scary it all looks." More laughter. It rippled outward, contagious. Arden felt the eyes of others drift toward them, curious, hungry. This was how it always escalated, not with orders but with entertainment. She wondered briefly if any of them would recognize the signs if they were reversed. If a lone man stood among operatives who saw him as lesser, probably not. Power rarely imagines itself on the other side. A heavy rucksack landed at her feet with a dull thud, dust puffing up around her ankles. 80 pounds at least, maybe more. She didn't look down right away. She followed the hand that had dropped it instead up the arm to the grin waiting at the top. Safety protocol, the corporal said lightly. Observers carry standard loadout. It was a lie, everyone there knew it. The lie wasn't the point, the reaction was. She bent at the knees, testing the weight with one hand. Her body adjusted automatically, spine aligning, breath syncing with motion. Years peeled back in an instant. She lifted the pack in a single smooth movement, swinging it up and settling it onto her shoulders like muscle memory waking from sleep. No strain showed on her face, no hitch in her breathing. She tightened the straps and looked at the corporal. Radio check 2. His grin faltered, just for a second, enough. The laughter didn't come this time. Instead, there was a murmur, low, confused. Someone muttered something under their breath. Arden turned away before the moment could stretch, returning to her post as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had changed. The drills resumed with a sharper edge. Commands barked louder, movements more aggressive. She sensed the intent building, the need to reassert dominance after a perceived slip. It wasn't conscious. It never is. Pride works best when it believes it's righteous. The warning shot came later. She heard it before it landed, the sound wrong, the angle off. Time slowed the way it does when the body recognizes danger before the mind gives permission. The round struck dirt close enough to spray her with grit, close enough to kill if it had been deliberate in a different way. Laughter echoed from the ridge. A lazy apology crackled over the radio. Arden didn't duck. She brushed dirt from her sleeve, looked up toward the sniper position and held up 2 fingers. A correction, windage, distance. They laughed harder. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest then. Not fear, not anger. The weight of knowing how easily things could turn irreversible. How thin the line was between intimidation and tragedy. She had crossed that line before. She knew what lived on the other side. During debrief she spoke once, just once. "That formation leaves your left flank exposed," she said calmly. 3 blind spots. The silence that followed was brief but telling. Then laughter crashed back in, louder than before, fueled by relief, by denial. Commander Rohr's voice cut through it. "You're overstepping." Arden nodded once and said nothing more. She closed her notebook. The sound of the clasp seemed louder than it should have been. Later, when they broke for rations, they made sure she stood alone. Bodies turned away in unison. Shade became scarce. Water passed hand to hand, always just out of reach. It was efficient, almost professional. She stood in the sun and let the heat soak into her bones. She slowed her breath, grounded herself. This wasn't new. Discomfort was a language she spoke fluently. Still, a quiet question surfaced, not for the first time. How many times does someone have to prove they belong before they're allowed to exist without explanation? The answer, she knew, was never. The challenge came as the afternoon waned, shadows stretching long across the mats. Jonah stepped forward again, gloves still on, confidence rebuilt by numbers and noise. "Let's see what you've got," he said, hand to hand, friendly. Friendly, the word tasted bitter. Arden set her bag down gently. She felt the eyes on her, the expectation, the hunger for spectacle. She also felt something else, a flicker of resolve settling into place. Not excitement, not anticipation, acceptance. Because once she stepped onto that mat, the quiet would end. And the truth would no longer belong only to her. She inhaled slowly, then stepped forward. The circle tightened. And somewhere deep inside, A part of her that had been dormant for years finally opened its eyes. Why did the noise fade the instant her bare feet touched the mat, as if the ground itself had decided to listen? For a moment the late afternoon air seemed to thicken. Dust hung unmoving. Even the wind paused, caught between anticipation and disbelief. 250 men leaned in without realizing they had, their bodies forming a ring that felt less like a crowd and more like a tribunal. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was judgment. Arden stood still, shoulders relaxed, eyes lowered just enough to read posture without provoking it. She felt the texture of the mat beneath her feet, the faint give in the canvas, the memory of hundreds like it across deserts, hangars, ships, places that never made the news. She felt her heartbeat slow, not because she was calm, but because she had trained it to obey. Jonah bounced lightly on his toes, feeding off the attention. He thrived in moments like this. Noise, approval, a simple enemy. He rolled his neck, cracked his knuckles, flashed a grin at the men behind him. Someone shouted a countdown. Someone else laughed too loudly. Money rustled again. Arden didn't look at the pile of cash this time. She had already measured the cost. Jonah lunged fast, confident in speed and mass, aiming to overwhelm before thought could interfere. Years of drills drove his body forward. Muscle memory screamed advantage. He reached for her shoulders, ready to dominate the space. She stepped half a pace to the side. Not away, inside. Her hand closed around his wrist, not tight, just enough to guide. Her hip turned. Her foot swept. The movement was so economical it barely registered as effort. Jonah's balance vanished. He hit the mat with a sound that knocked the air from his lungs and something else from his certainty. The silence that followed was sharp. Arden stepped back immediately. No follow-up, no flourish. That mattered more than anyone realized. It wasn't about winning. It was about control. Jonah stared up at the sky, chest heaving, confusion written across his face. He hadn't even been hurt, not really. That made it worse. Pain could be rationalized. This couldn't. He rolled to his side, face burning as laughter failed to come. He pushed himself up, eyes wild now, scanning the circle for reassurance that didn't arrive. Pride rushed in where logic should have been. He reached for the knife. The moment stretched thin, fragile. A few men gasped. Someone shouted his name. The blade caught the light as it cleared the sheath, intent raw and ugly. Arden saw it before most of them did. She felt the shift, the way play turns into danger, how adrenaline curdles into something lethal. Her body moved before her thoughts finished forming. She closed the distance. The blade slashed air where her face had been. She trapped his wrist against his own chest, stepping inside the arc of violence, her other palm striking upward with surgical precision. The impact snapped his head back. His body went slack before it hit the ground. The knife clattered away, skidding across the mat until it struck a boot and spun to a stop. Silence crashed down hard. Jonah lay unmoving, eyes rolled back, chest rising shallowly. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't conscious either. The distinction mattered. Arden ensured it every time. Voices erupted all at once, denial dressed as accusation. She cheated. She had something. Taser, check her sleeves. Men surged forward, anger and disbelief colliding. Arden raised her hands slowly, palms open, turning once in a complete circle. No weapon, no device. Nothing but skin, bone, and discipline. The mob hesitated. Rage doesn't like clarity. Then Commander Roar stepped in. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence carried weight, decades of myth wrapped in muscle and scars. He stripped off his jacket and tossed it aside, eyes locked on Arden with something close to personal offense. "Luck," he said, "that's all." Arden exhaled quietly. She hadn't wanted this. Not this part, but some truths demanded witnesses. He charged. Roar moved with experience, not speed, relying on intimidation and mass. He feinted, then committed, aiming to crush her center, to remind everyone who belonged on that mat. She waited until the last possible instant. Then she stepped aside and struck. 2 fingers to the nerve cluster at his neck, not brutal, precise. His legs folded beneath him as if unplugged. He hit the mat hard, breath tearing from his chest. She leaned in just enough for him to hear her, a Navy SEAL that week. The words weren't loud, they didn't need to be. The room froze. Roar forced himself up on one knee, rage overriding pain. He grabbed dirt and flung it at her eyes, lunging blindly, desperate now. The move was ugly, effective if unanticipated. She closed her eyes a fraction of a second before the grit hit, rolling with his momentum, letting physics do the work. As he sailed over her, she locked her legs around his arm and twisted. The sound echoed, a sharp, sickening pop. Men flinched, some looked away. Roar screamed as he hit the ground, clutching his shoulder, face twisted in shock and pain. Arden stood, breathing steady, looking down at him with something close to sadness. "You telegraph everything," she said quietly. "Fear, anger, desperation." She stepped back, giving him space. Mercy, not triumph. Medics rushed in. Orders were shouted. Phones were pocketed too late. Damage had already been done, not to bodies but to belief. Colonel Van pushed through, face pale, authority cracking as he demanded control. Arden reached into her pocket and removed the black metal card. Everything changed. The symbol etched into it didn't just carry clearance, it carried absence, erasure, the kind of authority that didn't argue. The old master sergeant saw it first. His hand shot out, stopping the colonel cold. "Sir," he said quietly, "don't." The words landed heavier than a shout. A helicopter's rotors cut the air moments later, dust spiraling as it touched down. A 4-star general emerged and walked straight to Arden, saluting her without hesitation. "She trained your trainers," he said to the stunned crowd. "Wrote the doctrine you live by." Roar stared up from the mat, pain forgotten, understanding dawning too late. Arden accepted the leather-bound dossier offered to her, then turned toward the exit. She paused only once beside Jonah's stretcher. She straightened his collar gently. "Check your blind spots," she said, "and never bet against the quiet ones." She walked toward the helicopter without looking back. As the rotors lifted her away, the men below stood changed, not inspired, not comforted but aware. And awareness, once earned, never leaves quietly. Why did the hangar feel smaller after she left? Like the walls had shifted inward to force everyone to sit with what they'd just witnessed. The helicopter's roar faded into the distance, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the noise had ever been. Dust settled slowly. No one spoke right away. Men who had faced firefights without blinking now avoided each other's eyes, suddenly unsure where confidence ended and arrogance began. Medics worked in tight, efficient motions. Jonah was loaded onto a stretcher, still unconscious, his bravado drained from him as completely as the color from his face. Commander Roar lay nearby, arm immobilized, jaw clenched in pain that went far deeper than bone. His legend had fractured in front of witnesses. That kind of injury didn't heal with time. Colonel Van tried to reassert control. His voice came out sharper than intended, barking orders that sounded hollow even to him. He knew it. Everyone did. Rank only mattered when belief supported it, and belief had just been shaken to the core. The master sergeant stood off to the side, arms crossed, staring at the spot where Arden had disappeared. He'd seen that card once before, decades ago, back when whispers moved faster than paperwork, back when entire units vanished overnight and no one asked questions because survival depended on forgetting. He exhaled slowly. Some ghosts weren't meant to stay buried. Training was officially suspended, but no one left. They lingered in small clusters, replaying moments in low voices. The wrist turn, the nerve strike, the way she'd never raised her voice, never postured, A few men laughed weakly, trying to shake it off. Others stayed quiet, staring at the ground like it might offer answers. One young ranger sat on a crate, helmet in his hands, heart still racing. He hadn't joined the jeers earlier. He'd laughed when others laughed because that was safer than standing out. Now the laughter burned in his throat. He thought about how easily the mob had turned, how close it had come to becoming something worse. He wondered how many times he'd done the same. That question spread, unspoken but contagious. By evening the base felt different, not softer, just aware. Conversations dropped in volume when civilians passed. Jokes died halfway through. A few men replayed the drills in their heads, suddenly noticing the blind spots she'd mentioned. Not because she'd humiliated them, but because she'd been right. Truth has a way of resurfacing when ego is stripped away. Elsewhere, miles away, Arden sat alone in the helicopter, hands resting loosely in her lap. The wind rattled the fuselage. The familiar vibration hummed through her bones. She stared out at the shrinking lights of the base, expression unreadable. Her pulse finally slowed. Only then did the weight of it settle in. She hadn't planned to step onto that mat. She'd hoped quietly, foolishly, that restraint would be enough. That professionalism might protect her. It never had before. It still disappointed her that it hadn't now. She thought of the unit that no longer existed. Faces she couldn't name out loud. People who had trusted silence the way others trusted medals. She remembered the night she'd walked away, believing distance might let the past rest. It never really does. The general across from her said nothing. He understood that words would cheapen the moment. When the helicopter touched down hours later, he offered her a simple nod. Respect, without spectacle. "Your file stays sealed," he said quietly, "as requested." She nodded back. That was all she wanted. Days passed. Jonah woke up in a medical ward, ribs aching, jaw stiff, memory replaying in fragments. The humiliation hit him harder than the pain. He didn't tell anyone about the fear he'd felt in that split second when her eyes had met his and he'd known, truly known, that he was outmatched. That kind of fear rewires a person. His transfer papers arrived a week later, desk duty, no appeal. Commander Rohr declined interviews. His recovery was physical, but the damage to his reputation spread quietly through channels that mattered. Invitations stopped coming. Doors closed without explanation. He learned what it felt like to be dismissed without ceremony. Colonel Van faced inquiries, not dramatic ones, worse, administrative, the kind that questioned judgment rather than intent. Early retirement became a suggestion, then an inevitability. And the base returned to routine, altered in ways no memo could capture. Civilians moved through the compound with less friction, not reverence, just space. A few soldiers corrected others when jokes edged too far. It wasn't kindness, it was caution. Respect born from consequence, not instruction. Far from the base, Arden resumed her quiet life. Grocery runs, morning coffee, anonymous flights. She unpacked the same backpack she'd carried onto the compound, laying its contents out with care. Nothing remarkable, nothing that explained who she was. She found the old photograph again, the one she always kept face down. She turned it upright this time, studied the blurred faces, the stances that told stories no caption could. She felt the familiar mix of pride and grief. Ignored, determined, broken, still standing. That night she slept without dreams. Weeks later, a message arrived through channels that didn't exist. A request, not an order. She read it once, then deleted it. Some missions were finished. Others were better left unanswered. She stepped outside onto her balcony, city noise rising around her, and breathed in the ordinary air. The world kept moving. People argued, laughed, struggled. Somewhere, someone was being underestimated for the 1000th time. She hoped quietly that they'd remember her story when the moment came. Not the fight, not the spectacle, the restraint, the The choice to endure until endurance was no longer an option. Because strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. And when it finally moves, it doesn't ask for permission. Why did the memory refuse to stay quiet, even after the world had moved on as if nothing had happened? Weeks had passed, but Arden learned long ago that time didn't erase pressure, it only redistributed it. The city outside her apartment pulsed with ordinary life. Car horns, distant sirens, laughter spilling out of cafes. It was the kind of normal she once dreamed about while lying awake in places where sleep meant vulnerability. Now that she had it, it felt thin, like a layer of paint over something cracked. She stood at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling between her hands, staring at nothing. The helicopter blades still echoed sometimes when the room was quiet enough, not as sound, but as vibration, a reminder that some parts of her body remembered before her mind caught up. She had told herself the confrontation was finished. The base, the mat, the faces twisted in disbelief. It was all sealed away again, locked behind the same internal doors she'd practiced closing for years. And yet, fragments kept slipping through, not the violence, the moments before it, the looks, the laughter, the certainty on their faces that she would fold. That was the part that lingered. She hadn't been surprised by it. That was what unsettled her most. Arden moved through her days quietly. She took the long route to the market. She sat in parks and watched people argue about trivial things, envy blooming softly in her chest. How lucky they were to believe the stakes were small. She answered emails from clients who thought they were hearing a consultant. She kept her language precise, neutral, untraceable. At night she trained. Not because she needed to, because stopping felt like decay. She stretched on the living room floor, muscles responding with familiar obedience. Balance drills, breath control, movement in confined space. No mirrors, she didn't need to see herself. She could feel alignment the way others felt temperature. Sometimes she stopped mid-motion, heart tightening for no obvious reason. Those moments scared her more than any fight ever had. Fear without an object. A body remembering a life the mind was trying to retire. She sat on the floor one night, back against the wall, knees drawn up, tired in a way sleep didn't fix. She thought about the last time she'd been this close to exposure. The night the unit had been shut down. Files burned. Names erased. Lives folded back into the world with instructions not to ripple. They had told her it was for the greater good. She had believed them. She still wanted to. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't rush to it. She never rushed to unknown numbers. When she finally picked it up, the message was brief. No greeting, no signature. "They're talking about you again." She stared at the screen, jaw tightening. Of course they were. People always talked when silence became uncomfortable. The story would spread in fragments, warped by pride and denial. Some would turn her into a myth, others into a threat. Few would accept the truth that competence didn't care who carried it. She typed a response, then deleted it. Whoever had sent the message knew better than to expect one. Across the country, on the base she'd left behind, the ripple continued. The mat had been rolled up, the blood cleaned. Officially, it was a training mishap. Unofficially, it was a reckoning. Men who'd laughed loudest now measured their words, not out of kindness but awareness. Awareness had a way of humbling people faster than punishment ever could. One SEAL sat alone in the locker room, staring at his reflection. He'd thrown a bill on the crate that day, had shouted odds. He remembered the sound her feet made on the mat. Not loud, grounded, the kind of sound that said she wasn't guessing. He hadn't slept well since. Another soldier pulled aside a young recruit during drills, correcting a stance, a habit. "Quiet doesn't mean weak," he muttered, surprising himself. The words felt borrowed. He didn't know from where. Even Commander Roar, sidelined and silent, replayed the moment in his mind when he'd lost control. The second when he'd chosen desperation over discipline. That realization hurt more than the injury. He had built a career on never making that mistake. Now it defined him. Back in her apartment, Arden finally responded to the message, not with words, but with absence. She powered down her phone and slid it into a drawer. Some conversations only fed the fire. She had learned the hard way that visibility was not the same as validation. She poured the cold coffee down the sink and rinsed the cup slowly, watching the steam rise. Her reflection wavered in the stainless steel, older than she felt, younger than her history. She wondered, not for the first time, whether walking away had been the right choice. Not from the base, from the life that preceded it. Redemption was supposed to feel lighter than this. The knock at the door came just after dusk. 3 sharp taps, controlled, not a neighbor. Arden didn't reach for anything. She didn't need to. She approached the door, breath steady, and opened it without hesitation. The woman standing there wore no uniform. Mid-40s, calm eyes, the kind that cataloged details without appearing to. She held a thin folder, edges worn from use. "We were hopping you, answer," the woman said. "I wasn't," Arden replied. A flicker of respect crossed the woman's face. "Fair." They stood in silence for a moment. Old habits negotiated boundaries faster than words ever could. "You made things visible," the woman said carefully. Arden leaned against the doorframe. "I tried not to." "And yet." "And yet," Arden echoed. The woman exhaled. "There's a problem, one that requires someone who knows when not to speak." Arden's gaze hardened, not with interest but with caution. She felt the pull immediately, the familiar hook dressed as necessity. "I'm out," she said, no anger, just truth. The woman nodded. "We know this isn't a recall." Silence stretched again. "Just a request," the woman added, "for perspective." Arden almost laughed. Almost. Perspective had cost her everything once. She stepped back, opening the door wider. 5 minutes. They sat at the small kitchen table. The folder remained closed. They didn't need it yet. The woman spoke softly. About a team. About mistakes layered over ego. About a situation escalating because no one wanted to listen to the quiet voice in the room. Arden listened. She always did. When the woman finished, Arden sat back, fingers steepled, eyes distant. She felt the old conflict rise, the one that never fully resolved. The desire to help weighed against the knowledge of what helping always demanded. "You don't need me," Arden said finally. "You need humility." The woman smiled sadly. "We tried that." Arden stood. "Then you're asking the wrong question." She walked to the door and opened it. The message was clear. As the woman left, she paused. "You changed something back there," she said, "whether you wanted to or not." Arden closed the door without replying. Later that night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The city hummed. Life continued. She thought about the young ranger on the crate, the way awareness had cracked something open in him. Maybe that was enough. Maybe redemption wasn't about returning. Maybe it was about leaving something better behind and refusing to let it claim you again. She turned onto her side, finally letting sleep take her. Strength didn't always mean stepping back into the fire. Sometimes it meant knowing when to walk away, and trusting that the echo of your actions would carry farther than your presence ever could. Why did the quiet feel heavier than the chaos ever had, as if the world itself was waiting to see what she would choose next? Morning came softly, without urgency. Pale light crept through the curtains, laying thin stripes across the floor. Arden lay awake before the alarm, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere below, a delivery truck hissed to a stop. Footsteps echoed in the stairwell. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds. The kind she once believed would mean she was finished with the past. She sat up slowly, joints loose, mind alert. For the first time in a long while, there was no immediate tension coiled in her chest, just a low, reflective weight, the kind that came after something had ended but before anything new had begun. She made coffee and didn't rush it. Watched the steam curl upward, thin and temporary. Her hands didn't shake. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. On the small table near the window lay the photograph she'd turned upright days earlier. She picked it up now, studying the faces again. Some were gone. Some had disappeared into lives no one would ever connect back to those shadows. A few were probably watching the news somewhere, feeling the same quiet pull, recognizing the shape of what had happened even if they never spoke about it. They'd all learned the same lesson in different ways. That invisibility could be a weapon, but it was also a burden. She set the photo down and stood by the window. People passed below, unaware of the histories walking among them every day. A woman argued on her phone. A man laughed too loudly at nothing. A child dragged a backpack bigger than their body. No one knew who Arden was. No one expected anything from her. That anonymity had once felt like exile. Now it felt earned. The story continued to ripple outward without her. She knew that. She didn't need updates to sense it. Truth has a way of seeping through institutions no matter how tightly they try to seal it. Instructors adjusted how they spoke to trainees. Commanders hesitated before dismissing unfamiliar voices. Some did it out of fear, others out of understanding. Both were forms of change. Jonah Cross sat at a desk far from the field, staring at a screen he barely cared about. His body healed faster than his pride. Some nights he replayed the moment he'd pulled the knife, shame burning hotter than the memory of pain. Tell himself he was provoked, that anyone would have snapped. But deep down he knew better. Commander Rohr recovered physically, but his silence became permanent. He stopped correcting others, stopped volunteering opinions. When younger operators spoke, he listened. Not because he was kind, because he'd learned what it felt like to be certain and wrong. Colonel Van's name faded quietly from active rosters. No scandal, no dramatic fall, just absence. Sometimes that was the most complete kind of judgment. None of it brought ardent satisfaction. She hadn't done what she did to teach lessons. She'd done it because pressure, once pushed far enough, always demanded release. The aftermath belonged to them. By midday, she left the apartment and walked the long route through the neighborhood. She passed a small gym tucked between a bakery and a dry cleaner. The windows were fogged. Inside, a handful of people moved awkwardly, learning their bodies, trying to feel capable in a world that rarely encouraged it. She paused, watching for a moment. Inside, a young woman struggled with a heavy bag, frustration written across her face. She reminded Arden of herself before discipline had replaced doubt, before pain had taught patience. Arden kept walking. She didn't need to step inside to know what the woman needed most wasn't instruction. It was permission, to take up space, to fail without ridicule, to persist quietly until strength stopped asking for validation. That evening another message arrived. Different channel, same tone, short, respectful, an invitation this time, not a request. She didn't answer it. Instead, she cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, let the day settle into her bones. She felt something unfamiliar begin to take shape, not purpose exactly, not peace, something closer to acceptance. She had spent years believing redemption meant returning to the fire and proving, again and again, that she was still useful, that her worth depended on readiness. Now she understood something else. Redemption could also mean refusing to be summoned by chaos, just because you knew how to survive it. Late that night she stepped onto her balcony again. The city lights shimmered, distant and impersonal. Somewhere a siren wailed. Somewhere else laughter spilled into the street. Life, indifferent and ongoing. She rested her hands on the railing and breathed. She thought about the young ranger who'd looked away in shame, the soldier who'd spoken up later, the subtle shifts that might never be traced back to her name. That was enough. Legacy, she realized, wasn't about being remembered. It was about altering the angle of things just enough that the next person didn't have to endure the same weight alone. She went back inside, turning off the lights one by one. When she lay down, sleep came easily this time. No helicopters, no echoes, just darkness, gentle and unthreatening. Tomorrow would come, ordinary, unremarkable, and that was exactly what she'd fought for, even if she hadn't known it then. Because strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it stood quietly in a room full of noise and waited. And sometimes, after the world finally listened, it walked away without asking to be followed.